As we move towards bringing children back to school, we must ask who was worst affected by the pandemic and why. Decoding Exclusion, an interview series by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, aims to discuss the various facets of the problem of exclusion in education in India. With a range of experts in the field of law, policy, and education, we examine evidence on new sites of exclusion and ways in which we can support children and their households as we bring them back to school. Welcome to Vidhi's Decoding Exclusion, an interview series where we break down the various facets of exclusion from mainstream education in India. I'm Nisha, and I lead the Inclusive Education vertical at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, and in today's episode, I'm in conversation with Leena Bhattacharya. Leena holds a PhD in economics from the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research and has worked in the areas of education, migration, and education technology. In today's conversation, we discuss the unique challenges and complexities involved in access to education for children from households engaged in short-term migration. We discuss in some detail about models of seasonal hostels, community living arrangements that are made available for children to stay in their source villages when their parents migrate. And we also focus on some models run in the states of Orissa and Maharashtra specifically. We also discuss the challenges that teachers and schools face in admitting and including children of short-term migrants. Building on extensive field research with migrant households across the country, Leena provides much insight on the experiences of these households in how they choose to migrate and how they navigate keeping their children in school. The conversation was extremely insightful for me, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you so much, Leena, for being here with us today. We are very happy that you could join us for this conversation. And during the course of this discussion, the main areas that we are really excited to understand from you, one is, of course, a little bit about the kind of research that you've done in the space of children and their access to education in India. You've specifically worked a lot on children from specific minority groups, including children from migrant households, as well as a little bit on gender, if I'm not wrong. Vidhi, over the course of the last 2.5 years, we've tried to do a lot of sort of evidence generation on how children have access to education, and especially children from different vulnerable backgrounds during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it'll be extremely beneficial for our audience to hear from more academics and more researchers who have done a lot more than we've been able to do over this course. But okay, so just to get started, over the course of specifically COVID-19, there are a few of your research papers that have come out that have spoken a little bit about access to education for marginalized communities. Could you tell us a little bit about what that work entailed and what were some of the key findings?
Sure. So I think a lot of papers did come out during COVID-19. A lot of it focused on the technology aspect of it. Although in the news media, you would see that the migrants had a major focus, right? Because they got stranded in one part of the country and then couldn't go back to the other part. But again, what I've observed personally is once they did go back to the places, the academic focus was still away from the migrants, the short-term migrants, moving on to the other parts. And as you mentioned, I had started some work with the children from short-term migrant families. And yeah, we could discuss about it more. And also, thank you so much for inviting me here.
Great. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we can jump straight into specifically the vulnerability of migrant children. As you've rightly pointed out, I think, at least for myself personally as a researcher, even though I've been extremely interested to understand the sort of challenges that migrant children face in access to education, I've often refrained from it because it is a very complex phenomenon. How migration in our country happens to begin with, and then how children and households sort of navigate short-term migration patterns and access to schooling and maybe shifting from school to school as well. So even prior to the pandemic, this has been a problem. So could you tell us a little bit about your sort of understanding of how short-term migration actually affects educational access?
Sure, Nisha. And as you mentioned, it is a very complex phenomenon. And hence you will see in research, there's a lot of focus on the migrants themselves, the adults who are out migrating, while the other members of the family kind of get left behind because they are children, and the factor is the parents are going, and also coming back. So let me actually break it down what short-term migration means, right? So what I'm talking about here is internal short-term migration in India. So what happens is these are done mostly by families from a very low income group. Okay. And what happens is a lot of them, they do not have their own land. So during monsoon, they might be finding some work in someone else's land and some means of survival. But as soon as monsoon ends, they do not have anything to do in the villages, yet they need some amount of money to just survive, right?
Yeah.
So what happens then is these people out migrate to another destination where they can get some work for the 6 to 8 months before the next monsoon begins. Hence the term short term migration, because they go and again they come back to the source villages, because it's a circular loop. uh, and like 2 times in a year you'll actually find them in the original village. Hence a lot of discourse kind of looks beyond them. But it's a good time to say that it's not a small group that we are talking about. So National Sample Survey Organization's reports in 2013, so Situation Assessment Survey, estimates that there are over 10 million households who have at least one short-term migrant member in the family. And
Right.
yet you'll see this paradox that, there are 10 million in one side and such less focus in research on the other side. One reason is, as you mentioned, is very complex. Second is the dearth of data around these people, so that, a lot of academics work, the quantitative academics, they work with it.
Yeah.
And you will see that it's not there so easily. And hence the discourse remains limited and focuses on some other groups.
So in the way that, you mentioned that like a lot of families, you have a single member of the household who might be the main, migrant from that household, right? But the rest of the family sometimes migrate with or sometimes stay back in the source village. So in terms of access to education for a child in this kind of household, do you find that they usually are within the source village? What are the circumstances in which they do end up migrating with family members?
So let me break it down again. Let's say there's a village, there is a group that will migrate and a group that will not migrate.
Yeah.
So for the group that is not migrating, fine, the children are staying back with their parents, going to the same school in the same environment. For the group that is migrating, they have a choice. Either they take the child with them or they leave the child behind.
Right.
Now, if I think of where exactly can I leave the child behind? So it's interesting to see that the national policies of education, for example, the Right to Education Act or Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, they have recognized the fact that there is this major challenge faced by the subgroup of children. And they have mentioned strategies so that their education rights can be protected. For example, one such strategy is operating seasonal hostels in the villages of origin. Now, to give you an idea of what is the seasonal hostel, and the first thing to tell you is it's not a separate building per se. That it's only operated for 6 months and the building remains closed. Imagine a government school and imagine uh, 2 rooms in that government school. So in the 6 to 8 months of migration, there are 2 rooms. One is left for the boys, one is left for the girls, and they are transformed into seasonal hostels. So there are groups of children who are staying in these hostels inside the school campus, protected by that boundary. So that is a seasonal hostel. Because the moment we say seasonal hostel, it might sound very different, right? Like the other hostels. So imagine you stay in the school for 6 to 8 months, and as soon as your parents come back, the hostels are closed again, they're dismantled and they're brought back into regular school classrooms.
Right.
And so the children can stay there. So this is a model that is followed in Odisha. Okay. So now the parents in Odisha, they have a choice of leaving the children in hostels or leaving the child with some relative that they might have in the village,
Right.
or to take the child with them.
Right.
Now, as you rightly asked, how do I decide? This is a super complex question to answer. Okay. One reason that has been commonly given in the literature, and I also observed from the field surveys, so 6 to 14-year-old children are eligible to stay in the seasonal hostels. But imagine a 6-year-old staying behind without the parents for many months. I met a kid, there are kids who stay, but it becomes very difficult for the child, for the caregivers, and the parents. However, over the time, the kids kind of pick up and they start enjoying the fact that they will be staying with their friends in this campus. And I've met older kids who have stayed in the camp, in the seasonal hostel. And they were saying that, look, I miss the seasonal hostels, because when I stayed in the hostels, they have this fixed timetable of what they need to do throughout the day. And one of which is going to school, which is essentially moving to the next classroom, right? Getting ready and moving to the next classroom. Uh, but if you're staying outside of the seasonal hostels, you might be doing household work, which you're not doing when you're inside the hostel. So there are kids who told me that, look, when I was outside, I had to take the animals out and I was doing this work and that work. And, I was not able to focus as much. So I wish the hostels could have been done at least till 18 or till we finish school for the whole extent, and not just under RTE until age of 14. So there are young, very young kids who are taken. Now imagine you have two very young kids, okay, and you are a migrant. There is a chance that you might take a third, like your third older kid with you who was eligible to stay, but you take this kid because the kid can take care of the younger kids. Okay, that's one. Then there are parents who are a little scared to leave adolescent girls behind because they don't know what's going to happen here. Although I must tell you that it's very unsafe for them there as well, because it's not like the parents are there with them throughout the day. So it's very complex on who is taken and who is left behind. But from what I've seen, a trustworthy hostel, and these are village schools, right? So you know who the principal is, the teachers are, the school management committee, and there are people recruited from the village as caretakers and cooks in the seasonal hostel. Okay, so you also know who the caretakers and cooks are. So if there is trust, the parents still leave the children behind because they know that at least the children in hostels, they can go to the same school, they're in the same familiar environment and things work. So this is for Odisha. In Maharashtra, so anyone can open seasonal hostels, right? So Maharashtra started opening as well. They figured that the hostels were open, but the children were not willing to stay. Like the parents were not willing to leave the children behind. So they dug deeper and they found that there were too many kids for that room. Okay, so there was no comfort, and there's this one maybe semi-functional toilet, and the drinking water is a problem. So they moved on to an alternate mode, which was called the community. An alternate living arrangement in the community. So they figured that, look, parents might be migrating, the house is not. So the house is still there, and the house is the child's comfort zone. Like they have their own arrangement there. So let the parents go out. The kids can stay in the villages. They will get all their food in the school. It's not like they are burdening someone else or someone of their relative.
Right.
And so they hence move to the community mode
Okay.
of living arrangement. So here, but then if I have to group it, the children who are staying in the source villages while their parents are away, they can still go to the same school and attend classes. Children who have migrated now, they come across a different horizon there. One reason being that parents do not go to the same place every year. So every year you're going to a newer place, figuring out what's there around you. They For Odisha, a lot of it happens, the migration happens in Andhra Pradesh. So a lot of children mentioned that, the language of instruction had changed.
Yeah.
Right? So there was a government school. By the way, the parents were very happy because they told me they got eggs, they got bags, they got uniforms. So with the utilities and with the things that they received, they were happy. But they didn't understand the language really. But now there is a memorandum of understanding between Odisha and Andhra Pradesh.
Right.
There's also a school, there are classrooms with Odia teachers there.
Right.
So there is a chance that the migrants might move to a place where they might find a school with Odia teachers. There are also worksite schools. I found this very interesting. I didn't know exactly how it was done. I came to know when I was doing my fieldwork in rural Odisha in 2019. So this is pre-pandemic. They were saying that while the migrant workers are recruited for work, if there's an educated migrant worker who has qualified board examination and cleared it, they might take that person as a teacher.
Okay.
Or once the people move to the destination area, they might just choose one and say, you are the teacher.
Okay.
So what that person is supposed to do is maintain record of all the kids there. And then some of them even come calling in the morning to get all the kids to like a makeshift room, which is called a school. I figured not a lot of learning was happening from the answers that the kids were telling me. Like they didn't remember anything that happened. They just remember sitting in the room, eating maybe. So yeah, this is a kind of thing that they might have access to some education there in the destination area. But a
Hmm.
lot of them mentioned that they were just taking care of younger siblings or cooking. And
Right.
the last part was, I asked that, were you working?
Hmm.
So here, the report I think was much lower than maybe true, because
Okay.
the parents were mentioning that they were not working, they were just helping us because they were wasting their time. So we were just
Right.
engaging them in something.
Right.
So, but engaging them in brick making is essentially they were doing it. But
Yeah.
I think the if I go back to the field again in the near future, I'll ask the question very differently now that I
Yeah.
know that they might be thinking of a more utility of the time. Otherwise, they're
Correct.
just wasting it playing.
Right, right. The kind of
Yeah,
thing that you might capture from sort of time use data rather than, asking the question directly,
exactly.
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because they might perceive it. They're like, no, no, no one works.
Yeah.
But you can't do it. They were just helping us.
Right. Okay. No, I mean, okay. So this is really interesting because both these models that you've mentioned, the sort of residential hostels in the source village, as well as the community living thing as well. A lot of this is stuff that I have not heard of before because I haven't worked in this space specifically. But I think you brought up a really important point that for younger children, especially in maybe the pre-primary, primary age groups where parents are most likely not going to be comfortable leaving them alone and shifting to another village. I think there's you're sort of suggesting that maybe the disruption that happens for migrant children in their foundational years is much higher than for maybe the older children, right? And I think that that's a really important point for us to sort of make note of, because especially as we're moving towards the sort of formalization of these foundational years, maybe that's an area that we really need to focus on when it comes to migrant children and ensuring, that there's less disruption. We had actually done a study sometime in 2020 or 21, where again in Maharashtra, so Bombay specifically, we were speaking to these EC centers over there, the Balwadis in Bombay city. And a lot of, they sort of mentioned to us, the NGOs that were running these Balwadis, that when migrant children come in, they sometimes don't, as in they accept them and they're admitted in the school, but they come sometime during the middle of the year, right? And these are very young children. So arguably, like some teachers would say, it's not so hard to sort of get them to maybe not catch up, but at least like get a little bit in tune with what's happening and teach them something while they're there. But a lot of other teachers said, okay, I admit them in my classroom, they're there, but I can't give them any special attention because they don't know what happened before. And then they're going to leave very soon. So I don't really, I don't know how to sort of teach these children. They're just in my classroom. So is this kind of experience something that you've come across as well?
It's a very interesting point, Nisha. So, as you mentioned, and I'll just go back a little in history and tell you that there were studies in the early 2000s in West Bengal, where they found that the principals were actually telling that, don't come to our schools because when you leave, it's shown as a dropout
Yeah,
because we can't account for where the kid went,
right.
which is very, very important in this context because everyone's trying to do the best, but then the principal was becoming answerable. But the principal
Mm,
just wanted to do like the normal thing by letting the kids enter.
mm,
But I think in 2010, after RT, after it was formalized, it look whoever comes in, whenever you just take them in without questions. So
mm.
this happened. But you're absolutely right. There were teachers who were saying every year the group of kids change as well. Like
Yeah.
there is no continuity. I have to start from scratch. So sometimes the children were saying they do sit in the classrooms. They try to follow what's happening. If it's the
Mm,
same language, they understand. If it's not the same language, they just maybe sit there for the time of the school, like have
mm,
a meal and then come back. But you were
mm.
right. So I think the alternate model where there are teachers, Odia teachers going to Andhra Pradesh now, so that at least the kids understand the language. But in a lot of cases, the kids responded that there was one classroom with two teachers, and all the kids were put together in that classroom.
Right.
Right? Then there are two teachers who are just doing some basics or not doing at all, and they
Mm,
couldn't recall what happened. I spoke to the a bit older kids. They said that they would just come and write ABCD because there were many kids. But then
mm.
that's the extent to which we did. And I asked that, can you show me a book, a notebook of what happened? So this kid responded, no, wo to I gave it to someone before I came. I
Okay.
said, okay, then that's the conversation ends here. But then this
Right.
is the thing I figured, as you rightly mentioned, that the teachers are also in two minds, right? What to do with this
Yeah.
kid who, as you rightly mentioned, will leave again and
Mm,
might not come back the next year.
mm.
So it's troublesome there. So the other thing that's mentioned in the policy, in the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan framework, is getting remote volunteer teacher, like who can come with you to the source,
Okay.
teach you, and then again you can go back together. So I think what's close is getting the migrant member to teach and go back. But this, as you understand, these are not like trained teachers, right? This
Oh,
one
yeah.
person who wanted to work, who is just
Yeah.
made responsible for the kids and
Yeah.
for teaching kids, which is not easy in any which way.
Mm.
So yeah, this is a problem. And as you rightly mentioned, the younger kids were definitely taken there, like below 6,
Yeah.
face a brunt of it. So they have to, sometimes the parents wait till they're 6 so that they can be left behind, because a lot of parents actually want their children to continue learning and to get out of this, because it's very very hard work for extremely long hours.
Yeah,
Like
for
it's
sure.
insane the number of hours they work. So they want, and a lot of a little older, when I say older, maybe late 30s or early 40s, people
Mm-hmm.
told me that we are not going anymore because we don't have the stamina to work anymore.
Right, right.
Okay. And there and this is just work hours. It's extremely hard and extremely long.
Mm.
And then they face a lot of challenges. I'll give you one instance. During survey, I was told that we had a kid of your age who we lost while he was working there. And
Oh,
when we requested the contractor if he could go back to the village and just give him a funeral which he deserves, they told us, you are one man short, so work harder and fill up for this man.
oh my God.
So it's really insane the kind of stories you hear in the
Mhm.
field, or the experiences that they go through are harrowing. So parents, understandably, they want their kids to study and to do anything to get out of it a lot of
Right,
times. But again, they also need the money for survival and for
of
meeting
course.
different needs. So uh, and in short term migration, what happens is they are given partially the money, and they know that they will get the money upfront when they migrate. So
Mm-hmm.
imagine when you know that you need money and you get it paid in cash,
Right, right.
right? So I asked it, why not Narega? Like you will
Mm,
get
yeah,
paid, and it's much like you can work from here. They said
yeah.
that, look, we don't know if we'll get work or get paid, but if I need money, migration is the way to go.
Is it? Okay. And
Yeah,
that's
so for them,
because Manrega is like because the pay is so low. Is that why they prefer migration?
so Narega, I think they are not sure if they'll get work or when they will
Right.
get paid because of the delay.
Delays. Okay.
Migration, they get paid upfront and a lot of
Right.
cash. Like imagine 30,000 per person in the family.
Mm,
So it's a
yeah,
lot of money in that area. As a
absolutely.
result, yeah, they choose to go because if they need money for something, they'll just go.
Right, right. Understood. Okay. Another point that I sort of wanted to, understand a little bit more, actually from a sort of policy perspective. So you mentioned that when you're migrating from one state to another state, this language, the medium of instruction then becomes a challenge. And when I remember when I was working in Ahmedabad, we would see that where we had a lot of migrant communities coming from, I think specifically Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, into sort of urban Ahmedabad for work in like their sort of industrial area there. And we did encounter a few schools that had sort of Telugu medium schools and things like that, right, for these students, because it had been sort of established over a few years that there is a demand for a school with this medium of instruction. Unfortunately, we didn't actually get to study that model and, at what point of time the state sort of recognized this as a need and where these teachers came from. So maybe it was the model that you are talking about, where the teachers came with the migrants itself or something like that. But from a sort of policy perspective, one, is there a way for, households to make this demand clear to the state, right? Is that something that's guaranteed under the sort of law or something like that, where households can sort of go to the ward counselor or, something of the area in which they migrate to sort of ask for this, right? So that's my first question. The second question, which is somewhat related, is that again, in our experience, we were sort of helping parents with admission under Section 12(1)(c) of the Right to Education Act. And we found that for the migrants, the income certificate, for example, that they did or didn't have, or sometimes their ID proof as well, didn't allow them to be eligible for the same entitlements or benefits in the new state that they were in. right? And these were sometimes parents who had said that maybe not short-term migrants, maybe they had migrated for a longer period of time. So this isn't exactly related to what we were discussing just now. But we basically found that where your ID is created and then your access to a lot of entitlements and benefits, whether for the student or for the household, so even in terms of ration cards and things like that, became a problem for these households, right? So is this, both these questions, sorry, but do you see some sort of need for policy reform here, or do you think it's more a question of maybe greater awareness amongst the migrant population about what they can do to sort of avail the benefits that should be accessible to them?
Thanks for the question, Nisha. I'll just answer to the best of my knowledge, okay? Because I think for a lot of short-term migrants, since they come back, right?
Yeah,
Some parts of it might not completely hold for them. The
yeah,
second part, which completely throws people off the game, is that they go to different places each year.
yeah, correct.
So, where do you bargain? And then I ask
Yeah.
this question that do you have a bargaining opportunity with the contractor,
Hmm.
right? Because when you're recruited, when you're getting paid, can you ask them that,
Hmm.
at least I need a school, so promise me a school for my kid.
Yeah,
So this person said, look, we are so easily replaceable. You don't
yeah,
bargain, you need the money. So
yeah.
you just go anyway and you wish there is something, but
Hmm.
you don't know that there will be something. So here, then the alternate is have a hostel in your village, leave your child in the
Hmm.
village,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So at least you can guarantee a school. So I think the
Hmm.
bargaining power there, there was not much in terms of the contractors. So they had to go wherever they were taken.
Hmm.
And as they were mentioning, so I'm just speaking on their behalf, is the supply is too high.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you don't want to get replaced. But then there were some people who have been migrating for a while. They kind of understand where the schools are and where they aren't.
okay.
Okay, so I think with experience and if they speak with each other, maybe they'll have some sense, but I won't say they have a lot of power here.
Hmm.
On the other hand, there are local civil society organizations. Lokdrishti is one that
Hmm.
works in Odisha. So they have a lot of these awareness sessions before the migrants go out for
Hmm.
the parents to understand what they're getting into, what they can do for the children, where they can leave the children behind. And they do a lot of surveys to understand how many children will get left behind this year or
Right,
how many are about to go. So can you convince the parents to leave them behind in the
right.
hostels? And then there's a continuous checkup of what's going.
Hmm.
And when the children are here, it's not like they're completely disengaged from the parents.
Hmm.
There are
Hmm.
also some amount of money that's kept so that the children can speak over phone and stay connected to the parent,
Right.
right? But from the bargaining power, I think for short-term migrants is very limited because there are still cases, a lot of cases of bonded labor, which is not legal,
Yeah.
where the migrants finally call saying, look, there is no record, and the
Yeah.
contractor is just telling us that we have not done enough. But we believe we have done more than enough. There is
Right.
absolutely no record now. What do we do?
Yeah.
Get us out of here. So I think with more bargaining power, maybe
Hmm.
all these would get out for the first thing, and
Right.
then moving on to like to the basics of housing and school education.
So when COVID sort of happened, now coming to, what the situation has been over the last 2 years, we of course all saw sort of how the migration crisis unfolded, right? And we had families who were stuck in cities without any sort of resources because contractors stopped paying them even. They might not have had a place to live. Many of them were living on site, which is also usually the case, but they have some basic sort of resources available to them. And then a lot of them sort of started walking back on foot as well. And I mean, apart from the fact that it was incredibly horrifying, and we saw that there were so many children that were also a part of this, right? And were like walking, kilometers and kilometers to get back to their villages. Do you think, or have you been able to speak to some of these families? Do you think this has sort of changed the way they might consider migration? Has it changed the way in which they take up these kinds of jobs, or the decision of whether they leave the child behind and things like this? Do you think COVID has changed some of this for the long term, or do you feel like it's sort of come back to where it was because of, unfortunately, them being forced into needing this money essentially?
I think for the short-term migrants, it's still the need driving it.
Mm,
But for taking the kids, let me tell you what's going on there, because there
mm,
you'll understand the worst part of it.
mm,
In 2020, when we all saw in the media the parents were stuck somewhere, The hostels were still running in the villages, right?
Right.
And then the news came that all the schools had to be shut because of the lockdown.
Yeah.
So the parents were just told, take your kids from the hostel. But the parents are not there in the village. Who will take kids
Right.
from the hostels?
Right.
But the hostels had to be shut. So it was a major problem where either they were staying with the relatives or some way, but they had to get out of the hostels. And the next year, now these migrants are not, migrating by choice. They really need the money.
Yeah.
So they need a way to work. And then the demand was still there for the migrants to go, and supplies, of course, very high in the source
Yeah.
villages. Yet the schools are closed, the hostels are closed, and there is no way a hostel would be open.
Yeah.
Even kids who are not migrated earlier, a major chunk migrated with their parents.
Oh God. Okay.
And now there are no schools in the destination region as well. The
Yeah.
schools in the source villages are closed. So a lot of migration happened. So there was a lot of local advocacy in terms of open the hostels. So the next
Yeah.
year when the schools opened, the rules for hostels or the regulations there were still not in place. So the
Okay.
schools were open, but the parents still knew that if they had a little choice, they would have left them behind, but they don't have any if everyone in the family is migrating. So luckily in 2020, late in 2022, I think the hostels and everything started opening. But then if the parents had already out migrated, then they couldn't leave the children behind. And there was a lot of confusion there. So I would say that the adult migration was still happening. The child
Right.
migration might have shot up due to pandemic, but
Okay.
the kids might have seen a side. The parents might not have wanted to take them there.
Okay.
So education wise, I think it's a school being closed, hostels being closed, plus maybe schools being open, hostels still being closed, and then education took a major hit for these families, but the parents still had to go. Now the
Right.
hostels are again back.
Okay.
So
Okay.
hopefully, yeah, like after a lot of advocacy, bringing this out in the open, because as I mentioned, the kind of research or attention that this group gets is very low.
Yeah.
Schools getting closed is a major thing. So everyone from everywhere can put a force, and there can be advocacy on it. But
Yeah.
when we're talking about like little groups which get missed out, it's very difficult to get everyone to focus there and say that, look, this is very important.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is like a long-term thing, because a lot of kids, I mean, first of all, there is a psychological shock of staying. Then there are too many accidents that happen in the migration zone, like when they're
Yeah.
out migrating in the destination region. Like I saw a kid's leg completely half charred because the kid fell on the fire. Okay, I heard of instances where the mother lost her child because of miscarriage, because she was still lifting heavy bricks and she couldn't
Yeah.
help it. So there
Yeah.
are too many accidents that happen. It's a long-term shock. I
Right.
even met a kid who said that he had gone with his parents and he was going to school, and then one day his dad just got up and left. So and then there were one man short. So as a result,
Yeah.
he has to work. Okay.
Right.
And there were even families that came back and they were been hiding since, because they're not supposed to come back. They told that it was extremely hard for us to survive. So we just ran away, and we know they're searching for us.
Oh God. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot of psychological cost that gets carried over time. So education wise and even migration wise,
Yeah.
I wish they could find some alternate here. So maybe some families could, but a lot of families still out migrated, and now the hostels are back. Hopefully the children will again find at least a space. Like parents should have a choice to decide what they want to do with the kids.
Right. Right. So, I mean, that's honestly astounding to hear that the hostels were shut overnight, but also not surprising at all, I guess, right? Because I think there's a huge case to be made here for the sort of power of decentralized decision making when it comes to things like this. Because with COVID, we saw this being a huge problem where we were, I mean, of course, it was a pandemic. We've never experienced anything like this, and everyone was in sort of panic mode. But you had decisions being made at the sort of, central level that had a bearing on hostels that are located in a village that maybe hadn't seen a single case of COVID yet, right? And
Exactly.
this was a huge problem. And I mean, the same thing with reopening of schools. And ultimately, it in individual villages, they started making decisions at the level of the panchayat or, the ward or whatever it was, the block, to say that, what, we're not being affected by this pandemic, but there are all these other problems that you're creating. And so now we're just going to do hybrid schools, whether or not you're allowing us to, right? So maybe there's a need, especially when we think about this from the perspective of future crises, or even things like, like climate change and things like that. And I guess Orissa would be a good example for a place where that becomes a huge crisis, right? But yeah, so maybe there's a need to think about sort of decentralized decision making when it comes to specifically these kinds of resources for migrant families, right? And protecting their sort of children from needing to be moved around and things like that.
I was also in a hostel during my PhD when COVID hit. Like,
Mm.
imagine all of us got this notice saying hostels are getting closed, but we are all very privileged adults,
Yeah,
right? So we can actually book tickets and go back home.
yeah,
I got stuck by, that's a different story, but we could go back home, right?
right, yeah,
But then there are these kids, you were just saying that, hostel is getting closed and the parents are not here. Where do these kids go?
yeah,
And
literally.
you just can't put like something on everyone and decide for everyone that is going to be okay, because you're
Yeah.
just stopping everyone from virus. Because much later I was speaking to the people in the village. I'm still in touch with a few of them, and they were saying that we don't know what's happening, it's just everything is closed because the cases were not high there.
Yeah,
Like, it's
exactly.
fast and it's open and people were okay, but they were just
Yeah.
given these things to do because people in the urban region were suffering a lot. But
Yeah,
then the
yeah,
rural area was still kind of not able to understand what's happening. And
yeah,
there are parents who are,
absolutely.
like finally reaching, and there are kids who are waiting. Like, everyone's scared, everyone's panicking. And now
Yeah.
imagine a parent and a child separated in this region. You can't even understand for how long, because every vehicle has stopped.
Yeah, exactly. There's no guarantee on how long the situation would continue at that point. Yeah.
But what's scary is, what if this was to happen again?
Yeah,
Would
yeah.
the same thing happen again? Because people might still not be very cognizant of the fact that these groups were actually excluded to even a more higher way than they were earlier.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I
No, I think
hope
that's
not.
that's a really important point. And I think one of the reasons why maybe starting discussions like this, but also taking this forward to people who actually make these decisions, right? I think there's so much need to sort of identify these unique challenges. And like you said, this is not a small population. We can't, turn away and be like, no, it's a very small group of people. One is even so, even if it were a very small group of people, it's not all right, for this kind of crisis to happen and to sort of repeat itself. But it is also an extremely large population, and we do need to have maybe more sustainable measures and like to really document what we've learned of this migration crisis during COVID, right? And to ensure that nothing like this, I mean, we don't sort of make these same mistakes again. So if I could sort of ask you a slightly different question from here. Like you said, there's been a lot of research during COVID on EdTech, right? And the way that EdTech sort of like blew up during that for obvious reasons. It has both good and bad sides to it. And as we all know, the digital divide became a huge point of sort of contention. But we still see that we are talking about hybrid models of education going forward as a way to deal with a lot of, situations where students can't access physical schools, right? Or can't access subject teachers, for example, where there is shortage of different types of resources in their sort of schools that they can physically access. So do you see any possibility of EdTech filling in some of the gaps that migrant children specifically face? Obviously, assuming that we have to jump through a lot of other hurdles to sort of get them access to internet and smartphones and all of that. But given that they're often moving into maybe urban spaces where digital infrastructure such as the internet is more accessible, do you think that EdTech has any sort of role to possibly play in the long term for these households?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this question, because when I was thinking, I was interested in the children from migrant families.
Yeah.
And post PhD, I've been working with IIT Bombay on this project called EdTech Tulna, where we are
Yes.
looking at quality of the learning softwares, right? And just to think that, can these two come together? Does it fit? Because when I went to the villages, they didn't even have smartphones.
Yes.
Okay, so like a very few of the people I met actually had smartphones. So doing this in the villages, I don't think it's possible right now. But as you rightly mentioned, they're moving to the urban centers, right, which might have more access. And
Yeah.
given that every kid is looking at a different learning trajectory, has had a different history, understands a different language, I think
Yeah.
it's very difficult for human beings to directly intervene wherever they go.
Mm.
So very, very hypothetically, okay, like no one should do anything based on what I'm saying, but from my limited understanding, there is a software called personalized adaptive learning.
Right.
So these solutions actually cater to the child's individual need, individual performance, and then
Right.
recommends where the child needs to go next.
Sort of like MindSpark was one of
Yeah,
those.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
personalized
yeah.
adaptive learning.
Got
Exactly.
it.
So depends on where the child is, the system adapts. Because
Right.
again, if I think of a digital classroom solution where everyone is watching the same content, and
Hmm.
imagining that classroom that the children mentioned, right? Like one room with every kid of every age group.
Mm-mm-mm.
You can't show one thing on the screen that
For
caters
sure.
to everyone.
Yeah.
But then PAL requires like individual hardware, which
Yeah.
is very costly. And
Yes.
since the group moves, it's not like you give one to them and they can just follow through.
Correct.
So, but I think PAL is something that has a potential of teaching at the right level, which has a major research going around it again, where the children can learn in the language that they are comfortable with, because technology can do it in a way that human beings are very limited. Like I can't speak 7 languages and reach to children speaking 7 languages.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
But technology can do it, and I have seen there are scope there, but again it's very cost intensive. And to be very honest, all these technology interventions are good at the starting, but over time, due to the depreciation and due to just maintenance, things fall through the crack.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I like with my limited knowledge, and I'm also a little skeptical because I have seen how this is working right now.
Mm.
So initially there's a lot of goodwill and interest, and it's very positive in terms of how it starts. But if I think like every year you keep moving, it's not like everywhere you will be using the same hardware, same software, and then you learn for 6 months, go away, learn in a different mode, again come back and learn using technology.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
but
is
then
a complicated one.
it's very complicated. But then maybe there is some way, there is hope here, rather
Right.
than sitting without a teacher or without anything to do. This is the
Right.
next best.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But that, I mean, you do raise an important point. One is in terms of sort of access to the tech itself, right? And like I said, during COVID, of course, this entire question of the digital divide and that kind of exacerbating inequalities became a huge point for us to take note of. And specifically the most like vulnerable groups of children, whether in terms of, like economic background, but also we saw that there was a gender divide in access to technology as well, right? And that became a huge challenge. So I think you'd also written a paper that was sort of related to access to technology. This was pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Was it NSSO itself?
Yes.
Right, right. Yeah. So because it was an interesting thing for us in the compilation of studies that we did, we sort of found that when it came to gender, there was slightly mixed results. So we did see some evidence, I think, from urban Chennai, if I'm not wrong, where girl students sort of had better access to learning materials and things like that than their male counterparts. But in all the other cases, it was the opposite and sort of maybe what we would have expected just based on sort of previous evidence. But yeah, so I think there is also something to say there when it comes to tech being a slightly double-edged sword, right? Where it maybe can also help us fill some of these gaps, or it can maybe just, exacerbate inequalities in a way that we're not able to help students then catch up. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that paper and sort of what the data said?
Sure. So as you rightly mentioned, this was using a pre-pandemic data. So National Sample Survey Organization, Survey of Education, 2017-18. So there, what I did find the gender divide present, but just in terms of access. But a bigger question remained about, imagine you have a mobile in your family. Who uses it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Or as we have seen a lot of things like during our EdTech interventions, is that if there is one phone, the dad who might be working might be just taking with him.
Yeah.
Okay, coming back at night and maybe one of the kids gets it. So there is one thing, and you're right. The paper based on Tamil Nadu actually found the like divide in favor of girls. But again, I think after post-pandemic, like as the ASA reports mentioned, the uptake has been much higher in the families because they wanted to provide a phone for the child to learn.
Yeah.
So I think the access numbers, no, I don't think, I mean, I'm sure based on the reports that the access numbers have gone up.
Right.
But the discrepancy still remains. I think that study found in favor of girls, but in a lot of cases,
Yeah.
actually the opposite. Who gets to use it and how? I'll just draw a parallel of this in terms of something else that I observed in the field in Odisha.
Mm-hmm.
Every kid was supposed to get eggs in the schools, right? Pure midday meal. They have some social custom in which the girls take an oath for their male siblings for which they won't be eating eggs. So now the eggs, like girls don't eat eggs, although the eggs are given to every kid. Okay. Similarly, if I think here, like having a mobile phone and maybe you just know that your brother is supposed to get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so in a lot of cases, the social norms and structures might decide what's happening. And what I found interesting in that paper as well, there was one more paper that you cited which looked at the learning time.
Yeah.
And they found that the learning time was not very different. It's also interesting that time use data 2019, this is also by NSSO. They also found that conditional on participation, the time spent by children were very close. In rural India, actually, it was the same. About 27 minutes in school. Because people going to schools have increased. So conditional being in school, you spend the same time. But as the paper rightly mentioned, that what happens outside of school?
Absolutely.
During pandemic, maybe the girls were asked to stay in.
Yeah.
You know, don't go out and play, stay in. So
Yeah.
once you are inside, you might just be sitting more with the device that you have, because what else will you do?
Right. Yes.
As a result, I think the components that they're measuring, either it's access or more specifically who gets to use it, and then the learning time, this will create like a mixed evidence of what's happening.
Right. So it actually reminds me of a slightly different, not related to gender, but more like caste-based sort of disadvantage when it came to access to tech. So a few years ago, I was sort of working on a completely different non-education related project in rural Rajasthan, and the village had like an area that was sort of for the ST members. There was a school in the middle, and then an area for the higher caste, upper caste Rajput families. And technology and like network was very poor there. But to sort of circumvent that, they had started like a small center in one of the Rajput houses with a computer. And the idea was that children could sort of come in there, they could take printouts of things, they could learn to use the computer. But then because it was in the house of a Rajput member, the children from the ST community weren't allowed to sort of access it as freely or as frequently. And it had to be something that was almost supervised by the panchayat at that point of time and things like that. And so even when we talk about like use of technology, and especially in, hybrid modes, a lot of people started doing in a lot of villages, these sort of community classrooms where you had tabs and things like that. But I feel like there's so many of these unfortunately invisible or less understood sort of social norms that just mean that the children who are already disadvantaged are still going to be in some sense left behind, or not able to access some of these resources, right? So I think that's also like a really important piece to kind of remember when we're talking about using something like tech, in terms of who uses it, and who's able to use it.
Absolutely. Just you reminded me of a few research papers that I was going through. It's very interesting. Initially in villages, there was one school and every kid went to the school. So even during my experiences, the villages had one school each. So every kid in the village was going there. But now within a lot of villages, a second or a third school is coming up. Maybe low-income private schools. And this years of work of getting every kid to start eating together, to remove this caste-based division, it's resurfacing again, because again the parents are kind of self-selecting into who was where. So imagine very similar to what you mentioned with the Rajput and the other community. If like imagine one school where all the like one group of kids go and the parents decide to install something there because they might be a little better to do. So in the same village, you're again kind of reinforcing the same divisions and the norms and the access. And it's increasing again. So there's a lot of research going around, like some research going around in this area, and it's very interesting, but also very sad as to where we are headed again.
Yeah, very disheartening. Yeah, I think we also actually saw a very similar thing. As you might know, Ahmedabad is on, very, very segregated for an urban space and on like sort of religious lines, right? And we saw like a very similar thing happening where in like a 1 kilometer radius, there were about 5 schools, low-fee private and government. And you literally could, I mean, of course, based on medium of instruction, you could say, okay, Urdu medium schools had these students going there. But then even just the government schools in Gujarati medium were separated by essentially caste and subcaste even, which was just ridiculous. But I would love to, read these papers that you're talking about, because it's one of those areas that really interests me and also upsets me highly.
Yeah, if I can add, Nisha,
Yes.
when I was a Teach for India fellow, my school had 7 schools running in it. Okay. So I'll just tell you, it was an extremely overcrowded school. It was in Pune, starting with Balwadi. Then there was Urdu medium boys, Urdu medium girls, Marathi medium boys, Marathi medium girls, English medium co-ed. And then there was a secondary school called I Teach School.
Okay.
So there were 7 schools going on during different shifts, and there were 7 principals. So you just couldn't take one decision.
Wow.
For example, I was trying to do this basic thing of closing the school main gate when the kids are inside.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And it becomes so complicated because there were 7 principals with different ideas. And just again about the crowd who came in, because I would see there were people coming in the school who I couldn't figure out why that person was in there for.
Absolutely.
Okay, it's very risky. But then if there are so many schools, you don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
But then, and right next to this government school was a private school. And then a kid from my class came and told me that, you know what, this kid told me, and okay, everyone was coming from the same slum behind the school.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, like the same community was catering to both the schools and all the divisions as well. And interestingly, you would see the separation within a family as well. The brother might be going to the co-ed English school. The sister in the same family was going to Urdu medium girls.
Correct.
And then I asked the parent, like, why are you doing this? Because both of them are free.
Yeah.
You could have just put your kid here. So there are so many norms and individual family fixed effects that are affecting this decision of which kid goes where.
Yeah.
But I rightly understand when you're saying this cluster of school and who's going where, and this divisions are again becoming very too much as the low-income private schools are mushrooming in India.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think the study that we did as well found a lot of exactly this, right? Where the girl goes and where the boy goes from the same household itself. We do know that, girls are more likely to go to government schools, but even in terms of medium of instruction, in terms of so many of these other things. Yeah. Okay, so I know I have taken up a lot of your time as well. So maybe I'll just try to bring the conversation back a little bit to, the larger question of migrant children, but also of out of school children. And so I sort of wanted to ask you, based on everything that we've spoken about and, all the work you've sort of done in this area in terms of access to schooling and who drops out and why they drop out along this sort of, whether they're migrant households or not. What do you think the state should sort of be prioritizing when it comes to this problem of OOSC? And this can be in the context of maybe some of the newer challenges that have come up because of COVID-19, or like, you mentioned the bit on hostels, something that isn't maybe advocated for or studied as much. But where do you think the state should sort of prioritize their energy when it comes to children having dropped out, and specifically migrant children?
Sure. One thing is just in terms of understanding who's moving where. And I'll give you 2 instances here. Blue Kudrishti maintains their registers every year, noting down everyone who left, the date, where to, and once they come back. And if they have something empty, that's when they try to reach that family. Like, you're supposed to come back and you haven't. What happened there? So this is one way of but it's there in handwritten registers for many years. But it's also difficult to digitize it in terms of just some of the registers are very old right now, and just because of the paper, etc. In Maharashtra, in the Saral mode, they have associated every kid to an ID number. And what they say is, as soon as that kid is going to a different school, the principal of the first school is supposed to say that I've given TC.
Okay.
And some school, somewhere, some principal, when the kid comes in, is supposed to note that this kid is here.
Okay.
So this is a way for them to note if the kids are just, out of the school system, or they have moved and where exactly, and for the way to track this movement. So I think the first point that I would say is just understanding who's going where.
Yes.
And then building this awareness sessions more often. I would actually encourage working with the local civil society organizations, because they have a lot more knowledge and community power, and they're very close to the community to understand, to speak up.
Right.
Because as you mentioned before, the decentralized decision comes very useful here. Rather than a state dictating that this is what needs to be done, have the districts and have the blocks decide what needs to be done for the specific block to meet their needs.
Right.
So I would say decentralized decision making with a little more data available for the academics also to start working, start finding out ways, and then collaborating with the civil society organizations and the school management committee members, because they have the most knowledge and the best knowledge about the workings of the school.
Right. And so
So
your suggestion would sort of be for intervention for migrant households in terms of whether it's tracking or otherwise to sort of happen at the source village, or when they, come to where they usually migrate to, because they also migrate to different places, you said, right?
yeah, so I would say source because of this, because there is no
Yeah.
one way in which you can reach them once they go there.
Right.
So have it in a source village, and even in terms of tracking, like let's say I'm going to village A,
Yeah.
but sometimes they'll just tell you the city. They
Right.
can't tell you where exactly in the city.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And there were people, when I went for the for the survey, they told me, you have come so long. I mean, you've come so far for this. So I told them that, you know what, you go very far for it. Like you
Yeah.
also go to work. They were like, yeah, that's true. But then, we are just taken. So like we just go with the group. So they might not even be able to tell you the specific area where they have migrated to. But in
Right.
the source village, I think that's the best part to get hold of them, because they also come back. Like a
Yeah.
recall method, once you come back of what happened.
Right.
And then if possible, figuring out who are the contractors that are actually at least adhering to human rights,
Yeah.
and then who are just, bypassing it.
Right. Absolutely.
Having an understanding, because I think it's the source where we can work the most for short-term migrant members. But to be very honest, maybe the implementation partners on the ground could differ with me because they have much more knowledge. I'm just mentioning from what I have seen and observed. That
Right.
is the
Right.
source.
No, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think just based on what you explained to us, it seems like that would sort of be the logical sort of step. But then I think this point about sort of maybe there needs to be regulation of contractors, right? And in the places where these households ultimately migrate, because we do know there is sort of repeated migration, even if it's not the same households. Especially, for example, with like brick kilns and workers that work in those types of areas, we do know migrants come in every year, even if they're from different places and different villages. But yeah, so that sort of crackdown on human rights violations when it comes to the actual contractors is maybe another area where the state can intervene, right? And has previously as well, even like rules about sort of creches on construction sites and toilets on construction sites, maternity benefits, things like this have come in over time. But of course, there are so many issues with the actual implementation of all of this, and ways in which contractors sort of bypass a lot of this. But okay, noted. That's very useful. And my sort of last question for you is, during COVID-19, there were so many of us researchers, practitioners, like people who've sort of been in this space for some time. And I mean, I will at least speak for myself personally. I found myself in a position of extreme sort of helplessness as someone who's in the sector, who's extremely passionate, who, even has contacts with a lot of households that maybe we've worked with before, collected data from before. But I found myself in a position where I was like, I'm stuck at home. I have no idea what to do with this skill set that I have, right? So just a sort of maybe more personal question for you, but do you feel like in some way we maybe dropped the ball or could have done something more when the crisis sort of hit? Again, unfortunately, I'm thinking of it in a sort of future scenario where these types of, I hope never the same type of pandemic, but sort of shorter crises do keep occurring again with like climate change and, other sort of health situations. So do you think there's more that we could have done as people who've been in this space for some number of years?
I had the same feeling of helplessness as you mentioned, because I think all of us were in a zone where we wanted to reach out, but also there were regulations and we were so new to the virus, we also didn't know if we would survive if we went out.
Absolutely.
Right? And there were strict rules and there were police everywhere. It's not like it's not easy to go reach out and just call and understand what's happening. So I think it could have been, like in hindsight, now that I know what has happened, maybe I would say that the first wave wasn't like the second wave,
Yeah.
right? And it was scary, the second wave. But then maybe we could have done more. But to be very honest, I think that collective at that point of crisis, when everything is shut down and kind of everyone is operating from their home, only in the villages did I realize were people still walking around. They were
Yeah.
just not able to understand what's happening.
Hmm.
So I think just a local contact maybe could have helped, but to be very honest, helplessness was the overpowering feeling for me as well.
Yeah.
Especially because I was working with the short-term migrant member families before, right? And I was working on my thesis, and I was also stuck. I couldn't go home, and I was
Yeah.
thinking, what is this? Like, we were supposed to do something when the need arose. How can I also get stranded watching the TV and knowing from the TV what's happening? And then just there were so many fundraising and just maybe contributing funds, but not
Hmm.
knowing exactly where the fund is getting spent or who's
Right.
getting it, how is it working.
Right. Right.
So I think we could have done better, but if I had to pinpoint, yeah, I'm not exactly sure where I would have fit at that specific time.
Right. No, absolutely. I think it's sort of that question that I've been asking myself of, when we work in this area and we meet so many people and try to understand what their challenges are with educational access in a time of crises, what is the role that we can play, if at all, right? And I mean, maybe the answer to that question is it's not our skill set, and unfortunately, maybe there isn't a role we can play. But I think some of these, points that you've brought up during this discussion, specifically the piece on hostels closing overnight, is something that's just like sitting with me, because I think it's one of the points that I absolutely had no idea about, right? And I feel like maybe that could be something that we sort of keep in mind, that maybe sometimes we uncover these things, through our research previously, and maybe those are the things that we need to sort of suddenly start advocating for in such a big way. Because I mean, I'm very surprised that I hadn't heard of that until now, and I'm sure it was covered somewhere that this was happening.
Yeah,
Yeah,
somewhere, but you understand it's Odisha again, local
yeah,
Odisha. So the mainstream media might be more curious about every migrant walking back. With
yeah,
this very
correct.
specific instance in the villages, might like you have to really Google with the specific keywords to find out. That's the extent to which I'm saying you need to Google, or
Yeah,
you might need to stay in those villages, or be in
right,
constant touch with someone.
right, right,
So
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think to be very honest, sometimes I think in the first wave, I was also living through other people who were
Hmm.
actually who could go out and help or work in the community. Like a
Yes,
lot
yeah,
of Teach for
same.
India alums, they were doing it. So,
Yeah,
kind of living through them.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then the second wave is just finding out
Yeah,
hospital beds and just, being on the phone, trying the best to do what we
correct,
can. But as
correct.
you said, I am not sure if I have the greater skill set to actually go reach out. Maybe, to be
Hmm.
very honest, maybe my academic side actually tells me, like, do it, advocate at the right places, at least get things done,
Hmm.
and then like advocate for the hostels to open, figure out what's happening, and not just collect data, come back, write your paper, and then
Hmm.
forget
Hmm.
about it and live happily ever after.
Right.
I think that's what, as an academic, I think my role is to just remember, go back, reconnect, and stay in
Yeah,
touch.
that's a really good point. And I think something is maybe because we're both in that sort of econ space where we do some amount of like primary data collection, and we end up like going to the field and making connections with people, during our research. And then sometimes we have to, I mean, the way we're trained is to sort of walk away, write about it, and then publishing the paper is the sort of end goal, right? And very rarely do we come across workspaces that actually encourage us to take that research back or do something with it beyond that. That's often not in a sort of incentive system. But yeah, I think I feel very, very sort of similar to exactly what you are saying as well. But okay, so that's sort of the, the end of the questions I had. Is there anything else that, you'd like to talk about, or anything that I might have missed out on?
I think we have covered most of it, but it's very good to know that you are in a space where you're actually connecting and you are going back and working with the people as well. Like you are in touch with a lot of knowledge that's on the field, because I feel in a lot of cases in econ, you can even bypass that, which
Right.
is not the best scene to be in, right? Like once you get data, you work on it, but then collecting your own and going and making connections. Because once we make connections with the people is when we actually feel for the topic, right? Not just think
Yeah.
of it as our next publication, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, I don't know if I wouldn't say that I'm one of the people who actually is able to go back enough. It's, I think, just something that I've recognized as being extremely important. So I feel like that's hopefully the next step that we can take as sort of researchers. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to say that I'm doing it well enough at all or at all. Yeah.
But I think
Um,
only when you start working with primary data, you start getting this feeling of not doing enough.
yeah.
Like if you do not do primary data, you might not feel anything at all.
That is also very true. Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so I mean, and anything else, any other questions you might have for us or anything like that?
I think we've covered most of it.
Yeah,
So
okay.
thanks for putting up that report. Hopefully the working paper will come soon, but till you can put the report up, it's very interesting and you've synthesized the study very well.
Okay, thank
So
you so much.
congratulations to you and your team.
Thank you so much, and we greatly appreciate your feedback and comments on that. And of course, this discussion, I feel like, again, one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because you very rightly pointed out to us, even when you read the report, that evidence on migrant children specifically and their access to education, there is a sense of apathy, or maybe not apathy, but just complexity that prevents us as researchers from really diving into it. And there are very few people that I think have been sort of studying it in as much detail and, documenting some of this. And even in our synthesis, you saw there were so few studies out of like 72 studies that happened on education, on COVID. I mean, I think only 2, if I'm not wrong, had anything to say about the migrant population, right? And that, I think, speaks for itself in terms of the dearth of sort of data and evidence on this.
Yeah. Like you
Yeah.
can take a 20-year period as well, not just
Yeah.
COVID. COVID is 2, you take 20, and you will figure that most of the studies, number of studies are very few, but in what that remains, they are based on primary data because the secondary thing is almost non-existent, very less.
Right.
So only 2007-8 NSSO's data gives some information. So a lot of papers were written then.
Right.
And then
Right.
2013, some papers were written then. But other than that, it's very less in terms of the attention. And I would say it's also kind of helplessness for a lot of quantitative economists
Yeah, for
who
sure.
might not have the bandwidth to go to the field and collect
Absolutely.
data. But then I think the other advocacy that people do, the researchers, is just, incorporate data. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
Like put
Yeah.
one question, figure out
Yeah.
where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, I
Because
was
you are
just
collecting.
gonna say, yeah. No, I was
Yeah.
just gonna say because I think from firstly the data sets that we have available to us in the Indian context are quite limited. But then when you sort of miss out on these key populations, so I think with like CMIE sort of gives you that option to add in certain questions. But again, you need to have the resources to be able to do that. But maybe like advocating with an IHDS or something there where maybe to add a section. And again, I think like researchers like you who have this experience and understanding of, short-term migration and maybe different ways to sort of capture that, maybe, for you to maybe work with them and sort of add those things in, because I mean, we face the same problem with children with disabilities, for example,
Yeah.
where a lot of researchers either don't collect that data or don't end up using the data because it ends up being a very small part of the sample, right? And they don't know sort of what to do. You can't make it a subgroup. You can't analyze it independently. And especially with quantitative, you're limited by, by that sample size ultimately. So maybe there's also scope for us as researchers to try and, advocate for these big data sets, actually incorporating these key sort of questions on these populations that are otherwise very, very understudied and marginalized, right? At least to create that knowledge somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So IHDS 2 has a question about migrants, like a small
Okay.
section. So hopefully if IHDS 3 follows the same pattern, then we might
Right.
have a little more insight.
Mhm.
But you're absolutely right. Like advocating for incorporating maybe 1 or 2 questions in the survey goes a long way in terms of the research attention that this group can get. And finally, like their rights can be brought forward.
Right, absolutely. No, that's amazing. I didn't know IHS2 had that. So okay, that's great. Good to know. Okay, great. So I think I've taken up a lot of your time, more than I had asked for even. But I just want to thank you so much for joining us for this and for giving us such incredible feedback on our report. And yeah, I mean, I hope we stay in touch and are able to do something together at some point. But it was really such an interesting conversation, and I feel like I've learned and understood so much, again, of a topic that I genuinely have not, known a lot about before this. So So thank you so much. And I know that our audience will be extremely, extremely delighted with all the information you've given us today.
Thanks, Nisha. And I would like to say that when I was reading your report, I was really enjoying it. And given my experience, I just wrote that, like this group, I don't see a lot of mention.
Yeah.
But then while writing, I was in my head thinking that maybe, this is not the focus, this will go out. And then when you wrote the final part, I saw all of it incorporated. And that kind of made me happy in the sense that at least there's one more person on one more team who's realizing the need of this group, just being a part of the bigger picture. So I would say thank you and your team a lot for bringing your focus back and doing this, moving ahead from the report to actually talking to me to hear stories about what's happening. And I think your personal experiences have added a lot. So I learned a lot from you as well about the things that I didn't know. For example, your example in rural Rajasthan, right? So just different examples and experiences that we have. I think we should keep in touch and at least keep sharing stories.
Absolutely. No, I would love to do that. Okay. Thank you so much again, Leena. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This podcast is produced by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy under the Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program. The Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program is a CSR initiative by Kotak Mahindra Bank Ltd. This podcast is based and born from Vidhi's report, Clearing the Air, a synthesized mapping of out-of-school children during COVID-19 in India. This report is produced under funding received from Voltas Limited as part of their CSR initiative. Video design and editing by Asad Ali, illustration by Hitesh Sonar.